We're back again. We left off with Howard Zinn. Who is Howard Zinn? What part does he play in this ideal of cultural Marxism, getting Marxism into the culture, the long march through the institution? Well, Howard Zinn's role as one of the evangelists of Marxism, his role is to make America stink, to revise America's history, to make our founding fathers all look like racists, slave owners, misogynists, Indian killers. That's Howard Zinn's role. He revised history, and his history books have become popular and famous, where you'll see many people recite many of the things that we hear about the founding fathers and about America is largely influenced by Howard Zinn. So we want to talk about who this guy is and what role he played in cultural Marxism. Let's listen to a video to start off.
Speak English, comrade. Remember, that is about the only freedom you do not have in this town. This American town.
Americans, they have too many freedoms.
That is another thing you must remember, comrade. For one day it will be your mission to destroy those bourgeois capitalist freedoms.
Good evening, friends, visitors, Bostonians, Democrats, communists, revolutionaries, all those who struggle for peace and justice and a better world. Welcome to this historic conference.
I'm proud to say I'm still an anti-communist.
In the year 1948, there was a series of pamphlets were distributed by the House Committee on Un-American Activities entitled 100 Things You Should Know About Communism. I came across this in my files. I keep files on them. It's only fair. I was impressed by the thought that the committee knew 100 things about communism. Anyway, the pamphlets had 100 questions and answers. Question 1, what is communism? So the idea is to start with something easy, something that requires a brief answer. Answer, a system by which one small group seeks to rule the world. The answer was probably drawn up by the people who later founded the Trilateral Commission.
Can I skip to question 76?
Where can a communist be found in everyday life? Well, this question particularly interested me because there have been times when I was in need of a communist. Didn't know where to find one. Answer, look for him in your school, your labor union, your church, or your civic club. Question 86. Is the YMCA a communist target? This really worried me. I always wondered why there was so much chlorine in the YMCA. Answer, yes. So is the YWCA. Between a kind of reasonable criticism you could have of communism, socialism, of the Soviet Union, of governments, of states, whatever they call themselves, the difference between that kind of criticism and indignation and the kind of murderous, indiscriminate hatred which leads us to threaten to drop bombs to kill all of the citizens of this country, presumably the citizens of governments where the citizens themselves are victims, and we're prepared to kill all of them, presumably to save them, as we've always been ready to kill people to save them from communism.
Well, I was fired from my first teaching job because I was involved with a student movement in Atlanta. Radicals in American history, and by radicals I mean, oh, they've been communists, they've been socialists, they've been anarchists, they've been all sorts of people who want things changed, who've been indignant at the way things are going. And these radicals, these anarchists, these socialists, these communists, without them, we would not have had the kind of changes that took place in this country, which were good changes. Because very often these people, these agitators, these radicals, they were the ones who were needed to start things off.
That's just a little intro to Howard Zinn. Notice how the best way to marginalize or deny the reality of a thing is to laugh at it, mock it, make fun of it. And so in the audience, he's very funny. He's a playwright, so he's very engaging. People talk about his personality. So he makes light of communism. He laughs at it and gets other people to laugh with it. But when he sits down, the latter part of the presentation or latter part of the interview, you see he was talking with him. Then he got down to business and he admitted communism. And he talks about the communists and the revolutionaries were needed to make a change. So that's his true sentiments. That's what he believes. Well, who is Howard Zinn? Howard Zinn was born in August 1922 to Jewish immigrant parents. Both were factory workers in Brooklyn, New York. He was a member of the Communist Party. In the late 1940s, Zinn served as vice chairman for a Brooklyn branch of the American Labor Party, an organization run and dominated by communists. You notice he was laughing and mocking in the video, the first part. He was saying he keeps files on the FBI too. That's what he's making fun of. They kept files on him, so he's laughing and saying, I keep files on them too, it's only right. Well, in 1949, the FBI opened a domestic security investigation on Zinn, 422-page FBI file, and there's the number there, because of his involvement with communist front groups like ALP, and his status as an active member of the Communist Party USA. In 1951, Zinn taught a basic Marxism class at the Communist Party USA's Brooklyn, New York headquarters, where he emphasized that the basic teachings of Marx and Lenin were sound and should be adhered to by those who were listening to his audience. So he teaches, again, now someone might say, well, you're teaching on communism. Yeah, but I'm teaching against communism. I'm warning about the dangers of communism. I'm talking about the tenets of it and the followers, and they're using their own words. But here he's teaching the basics of Marx and Lenin. He said that they were sound and they should be adhered to. I say they should be rejected. He says they should be adhered to. According to one of his students, Alice Walker, Zinn, at the very height of the communist takeover of China, once told a local white audience, I stand to the left of Mao Zedong. Now, we did a profile of Mao in one of our earlier segments in the military section. We talked about military Marxism. And when Mao came to power, 70 million Chinese lost their lives. So he was a radical believer in Marxism. Well, Zinn tells these individuals that he's talking with that he stands to the left of Mao. So he's really radical. Then also he wrote a book, it's called, well, he wrote a history book, it's called A People's History of the United States. The author of more than 20 books, Zinn is best known for writing A People's History of the United States. It was published in 1980. A Marxist tract that describes America as a predatory and repressive capitalist state, sexist, racist, imperialist, that is run by a corporate ruling class for the benefit of the rich. Talk about your critical theory. Remember, we in our last time we got together, we were explaining what critical theory is. And so he's certainly using critical theory to its fullest extent. He goes on, or the description, the book claims to present American history through the eyes of the nation's many victim groups: workers, American Indians, slaves, women, blacks, and populists. So in other words, it tells the American story through the eyes of the proletariat, the victim class. A People's History has sold more than 1 million copies, and according to what some sources you read, it talks about 2 million copies, making it one of the best-selling history books of all time. Despite its lack of footnotes and other scholarly apparatus, it is one of the most influential texts in college classrooms today, not only in history classes, but also in such fields as economics, political science, literature, and women's studies. ZINN, he majored in history and he minored in economics. But I'm going to introduce you to a book, a work. I'll talk about it at the end of this presentation. It's called Debunking Howard Zinn, GRABAR. Mary GRABAR is her name, and she is a historian. And in her book, she talks about how he was just a revolutionary and a rebel in all of the jobs that he worked at as a professor. He never went in to teach history, and he would remark often that it doesn't matter what the course was, he was going to teach what he taught. And he was always bucking heads with the administration of whatever university he worked at. So anyway, that's a little bit about his work. He says, I wanted my writing of history and my teaching of history to be a part of social struggle. There's that struggle. Marx was talking about the proletariat struggle. The Frankfurt School talks about the struggle between all these classes, the cultural struggle. And so Zinn also keeping in with that narrative talks about the social struggle. He didn't want to just write about history. He wanted to write history and talk about the social struggle. He said, I wanted to be a part of history and not just a recorder and a teacher of history. So that kind of attitude toward history itself as a political act, has always informed my writing and my teaching. Zinn's ultimate goal was to influence new generations of young students. Christopher Columbus, this is some of the things that are in his book. When you read his book, the first chapter of A People's History of the United States deals with Christopher Columbus. And when you see this, we wonder why people all over the United States are pulling down statues of Christopher Columbus. This started a long time ago, even back in the 90s, when people started protesting Christopher Columbus because of the influence of Howard Zinn's writings and his teachings throughout universities and high schools and middle schools. And so his first chapter deals with Christopher Columbus. He said Christopher Columbus was a homicidal maniac and an Indian slayer. Never mind that Christopher Columbus wrote about his voyages. He has his own journal that he writes. And if anyone wants to really know who Christopher Columbus was, refer to his journals rather than some individual who came along 500 years later just to malign the man's name. He also goes on and says the Pilgrims were white invaders of inhabited land. That's where we get the whole idea of the Pilgrims, the white man, the white Christian came over here and stole the Indians' land and all of that. I'm going to talk about that a little later. The Native Americans were peaceful and lived in harmony with other tribes. As a matter of fact, in his book, he makes it almost seem like that they were sort of like hippie that lived in communes that all got along with each other, sort of like old communists. Then also he says the founding fathers were greedy deists, racists, and slave owners. And then somebody, I'm sure, who's listening to this saying, well, they were. Well, some of them were and some of them weren't. They make it seem like all of them were. Again, that's revising history, changing history into something different, because you have to change the culture to make a new culture. Then also he spoke against every war in which America fought against communism, naturally, because he was a communist. Zinn's book contends that Maoist China was the closest thing in a long history of that ancient country to a people's government independent of outside control. Are you kidding me? Mao killed 70 million people to come to power, and it was a people's movement. Then also he said Castro's Cuba had no bloody record of suppression. Well, Che Guevara was Castro's hitman. And so no bloody record. Again, this is just outright lie. This is not just a revising of history. This is a lying and a hiding of it and a whitewashing of it. Also, the Marxist dictators of Nicaragua in the 1980s were welcomed by the people, while the Contras, supported by America, were a terrorist group. Of course, anybody who America supports is a terrorist group, according to a communist. In May 2004, Marx in Soho, which was a play that ZINN wrote, a play that ZINN wrote as a medium to revive Karl Marx for the new millennial. See the connection? Go back to Marx. Marx is their apostle. Marx is their savior. Marx is their founder. Marx is their go-to. He is their example. They read his works and they admire his life. And so he loved Karl Marx so that he wanted to revive. He wrote a play so that he can reintroduce Marx to a new millennial. Well, it premiered in Havana, Cuba. Oh, how convenient. On the occasion of that premiere, ZINN told the Cuban publication La Jarabila. This is what he said. Marx is not dead. Well, yes, he is. And we as Christians, when we say Jesus Christ is risen, then people mock and laugh at that and say, oh, no, he isn't. But many times these leftists, they say, oh, Marx lives on in his writing and so lives on in whatever his deeds. Well, he writes this Marx in Soho. He says, Marx is not dead, and I'm going to try to prove it by bringing him back on the scene. I know he's speaking metaphorically, but he's talking about resurrecting Marx's ideals. And from there, I'll show the US public what Marxism is really about. Marx himself would explain the difference between Stalinism and Marxism. I'll remind the people what Marx's criticism of capitalism was. I would demonstrate that these ideals have much to do with the United States today. In other words, that Marx's criticism today is exact and current. In other words, if Marx were still alive, he'd be complaining about America just like he complained about the bourgeoisie of his day. In a March 2009 speech, ZINN praised President Barack Obama and disparaged capitalism. Obama has become president at a very special time when the American capitalist system is falling apart. And good, I'm glad it's falling apart, because unless the system falls apart, we're not going to do anything about it. So we see here that he obviously shows his contempt for capitalism. Capitalism is just simply the free market exchange of goods and services. You have, according to some publications, some statistics, anywhere from, I've read from anywhere from 45 to over 60% of Americans work for small business. So small business is the engine to the American economy. Most Americans work for small business. That's capitalism, the free market exchange of goods and services. Most people do not work for Amazon and Microsoft and Walmart. You know, many times in our media, what they do is they prop those big Fortune 500 companies up, which many people refer to as crony capitalism, and we know that we have that. But many times they prop that up to say that represents capitalism. Those greedy, evil capitalists. Many times that's what happens. We see in Hollywood, we see in academia, and we see in our media, and many times in politics. Capitalism is equated with greed. But that's not true. Capitalism is just, again, merely the free exchange, free market exchange of goods and services. Many of us know capitalists. Many of us know people who are in business for themselves, and all of us benefit from capitalism. I'm sitting here on a stupid computer talking to people all over the world who will listen to me. Most times my videos only get maybe 23 to 50 views. That's okay, but I have something to say. But my point is, the computer and the computer software and the systems and Zoom that I'm using and Microsoft PowerPoint and all of these things, that's all a part of capitalism. Someone got an ideal, someone got an invention, they put up their capital, they put their risk, they put their blood, sweat, and tears, they had a dream, and they made it work, and sometimes they grew to be large, but the majority of capitalists are small business, and they are the engine that fuels America. That's all capitalism is, but these individuals despise capitalism because it's related to private ownership, private property, private wealth, and they despise that. So here he's praising the fact that Barack Obama has come into office back in 2009, and he's saying he hopes that capitalism falls apart. But a little also unknown information about Barack Obama, and we're going to be doing a profile on him later on in our presentation. We're going to go there. We're going to talk about it. But I remember watching videos of Barack Obama standing before high school students telling them that capitalism has failed. Capitalism does not work. Can you imagine that? The president of the free world. Capitalism has made America the greatest nation on the earth. Our enemies say that we're the greatest nation on the earth. I mean, outside enemies like China and Russia and other nations, they talk about the greatness of America, but we have people inside America who thinks that America is the worst nation ever to exist. So let's move on. So here's Mary Grabar debunking Howard Zinn. She does an excellent work. It's called Debunking Howard Zinn, subtitle, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. This man right here is responsible for turning many individuals against their country. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't defend what you hate. And that's why lots of people who benefit from this nation also wind up hating this country. And Howard Zinn had a large role to play with that. I recommend you get Mary Grabar's book, Debunking Howard Zinn. It's an excellent work. She is a historian, academic historian. She's taught in universities for over 20 years. And so she's a professional in her field. And what she does is she goes through Howard Zinn's people's history, and she dismantles it, and she goes step by step, and she explains, this is what he quotes, this is what he says, and then she gives the real history behind it. But then she also shows how Howard Zinn plagiarized from earlier works as well. And so I recommend, it'll be a great read for you to get. It's called Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America, Mary Grabar. Now, let's move on. These are the players in this cultural Marxism, this cultural revolution. Saul Alinsky. Who is Saul Alinsky? Let's get into this.
And one of Gramsci's all-star disciples, Saul Alinsky, became one of the most influential radicals of the 1960s.
Well, Saul Alinsky was a prominent radical in 1930s Chicago. He worked closely with the Communist Party. He used to go down and train at the rifle range with Leon Dupre, who was later a mentor of Barack Obama. And they used to train to shoot because they knew the revolution was just around the corner. But that didn't come, so he got a bit more subtle.
Well, Saul Alinsky called for a community organizer to stir things up, to create agitation. In fact, he said, you'll be accused of being an agitator, and that's exactly what you are. He wanted the haves and have-nots fighting with each other.
It wasn't until I was watching an old film from World War II that I realized what the left has been doing in America to pit the poor against the rich, blacks against whites, and the young against the old is the same tactic Hitler used to disunify Germany.
You see, they knew that they were not strong enough to conquer a unified country. So they split Germany into small groups. They used prejudice as a practical weapon to cripple the nation. Remember that when you hear this kind of talk. Somebody's going to get something out of it, and it isn't going to be you.
And they use the conflict as justification for more government to stop the chaos. So they create the chaos, and then they step in as a solution to the chaos. And as Francis Schaeffer said, once this chaos comes, most people will willingly give over to authoritarianism because they don't want the chaos.
His book was kind of the field manual, if you will, for these activist organizations.
Which President Obama studied and taught at a workshop for 4 years in Chicago as a community organizer for ACORN.
As I was reading through Rules for Radicals to see where he was coming from, I just happened to take a look at the dedication in the front of the book. And this is what I saw. Quote, "Lest we forget at least an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the very first radical, the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively that he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer," unquote. Saul Alinsky from Antonio Gramsci has had an incredible amount of influence on our president and on our society, and he dedicates his book openly to Lucifer, Satan. I think that says more about where their ideas and plans are based than anything else.
You asked what Saul Alinsky's impact is on the leftist movement today, and it basically defines it. It defines it.
Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radicals. He created a blueprint, and we're going to talk about that dedication in a second. Created a blueprint for revolution under the banner of social change. Listen to the language. Social change. And he's going to tell you what he means by change. Two of his most notable modern day disciples are Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. He's the author of the book, Rules for Radicals. He is the father of community organizers. And he says, as he explains, I have the book, I purchased it and I've read it. And community organizer is a euphemism for revolution. And that is Marxist revolution. Saul Alinsky was born to Russian Jewish parents in Chicago on January 30th, 1909, but was personally agnostic regarding religion. Author of political commentator David Horowitz writes that Alinsky came of age in the 1930s as a communist fellow traveler. So again, Saul Alinsky was a communist. All these individuals were committed to the communist, the Marxist ideology. Alinsky described himself as a small c communist, meaning that he embraced the principles of communism, but never formally joined the Communist Party. Well, what difference does it make if you join the Communist Party or not? If you follow their ideologies, if you implement all their ideology, what does it mean if you're not a member? Doesn't, you know, but anyway, that's how you get away with it. He said, I'm a small communist. Hey, I follow all their tenets, but I'm not a member of the Communist Party. Well, what difference does it make? I'm sure he spoke it and all of that, and he carried it out. Alinsky studied criminology as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, during which time he became friendly with Al Capone and his mobsters. Ryan Leza, senior editor of the New Republic, offers a glimpse into Alinsky's personality. Charming and self-absorbed, Alinsky would entertain friends with stories, some true, many embellished, from his mob days for decades afterwards. He was profane, outspoken, and narcissistic, always the center of attention despite his tweedy academic look and thick horn-rimmed glasses. And so in his book, Rules for Radical, he brags about hanging out with Al Capone and Frank Nitti, you know, Al Capone's strong man, his strong arm, his hit man. And he would hang out with Frank Nitti, and he would even critique Frank Nitti when they had to put a hit out on someone. He talks about how sometimes Frank Nitti would go get someone from out of town to carry out the hit rather than doing it because, again, you know, they wanted to keep friendly relations with other people, whatever. But Saul Alinsky was so rough, he said, doesn't matter, you should take him out anyway, you should whack the guy. So Saul Alinsky had no compassion. He was even more fierce than Frank Nitti, in other words. And this is the kind of person that has influenced thousands of young people and many of our politicians, as we will see. In the Alinsky model, organizing is a euphemism for revolution. A wholesale revolution whose ultimate objective is the systematic acquisition of power by a purportedly oppressed segment of the population. That's that new proletariat. And the radical transformation of America's social and economic structures. So Marx wanted to transform the West economic structure. But here we see consistently that this is a cultural revolution. He wanted to transform America's social and economic structure. The goal is to foment enough public discontent, moral confusion, and outright chaos to spark the social upheaval that Marx, Engels, and Lenin predicted. A revolution whose foot soldiers view the status quo as fatally flawed and wholly unworthy of salvation. In other words, there's nothing salvageable about America. That's critical theory. Burn it all down. That's what they believe. Thus, the theory goes, the people will settle for nothing less than that status quo's complete collapse, to be followed by the erection of an entirely new system upon its ruins. The same thing Gramsci and Marcuse and Lukács, the same thing. So again, there's no break in this chain. They all implement it different ways, but they all are in agreement with the tenets of Marxism. Toward that end, they will be apt to follow the lead of charismatic radical organizers who project an aura of confidence and vision, and who profess to clearly understand what types of societal changes are needed. But ALINSKY'S brand of revolution was not characterized by dramatic, sweeping, overnight transformations of social institutions. That's consistent with what Gramsci taught, the long march through the institutions. They realize that it's going to take time, and they've been at it for a long time. But we are certainly seeing the fruits of what's been at work for over 90 years. We're seeing the fruition. It's taking place in our streets and our universities right now. As Richard Poe puts it, ALINSKY viewed revolution as a slow, patient process. The trick was to penetrate existing institutions such as churches, unions, and political parties. Get that one? Political parties. We're going to find out which political party they got into or penetrated. He advised organizers and their disciples to quietly, subtly gain influence within the decision-making ranks of these institutions and to introduce changes from that platform. This was precisely the tactic of infiltration advocated by Lenin and Stalin. In 1946, ALINSKY wrote Reveille for Radicals, his first major book about the principles and tactics of community organizing, otherwise known as Agitating for Revolution. It's always about the revolution. 25 years later, he authored Rules for Radicals, which expanded upon his earlier work. His writings and the tactics outlined therein have had a profound influence on all social change and social justice. We hear that word bandied about a lot nowadays also. There you see Reveille for Radicals, which is the handbook for community organizers, and then Rules for Radicals, which gives them their marching orders. Let's look at some of the contents of Rules for Radicals. And this, of course, is the dedication page. He made 3 dedications, and this also he makes a dedication to Lucifer. Now, again, many believe that Lucifer is referring to Satan. I wrote a book called Satan as He Wants to Be Seen, and I examined that theory and looking at Isaiah chapter number 14, and then also is where the word is found, Lucifer is found in the King James, and then also Ezekiel chapter number 28, talking about the king of Tyre. And I do a thorough examination. Again, I'm just a Bible teacher. I'm not a Bible scholar. I don't claim to be. But what I did is I took the words of many early commentators and other theologians to show that Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28 is clearly talking about and referring to human kings. But it largely was conflated into the church world as a reference to Lucifer. And then, of course, well, let me back up and put it this way. The teaching, they say, is found in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel chapter 28. Now, we just saw that Saul Alinsky was an atheistic or agnostic Jew. So do we actually believe, can we convince ourselves that Saul Alinsky sat down and studied in context Isaiah chapter number 48 and Ezekiel chapter number 28 and came to the conclusion that Lucifer was the devil? No. He gets the idea because of classic literature, John Milton's Paradise Lost, and also Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, Inferno, Dante's Inferno. And this is where this idea of Lucifer being a fallen angel comes from. This is where Saul Alinsky gets the idea. But having said all of that, he still links it to, again, this Lucifer, this Satan, this evil entity rebelling against the establishment and gaining his own kingdom. That's the point. He makes a dedication to that. Any way you look at it, it's still an evil move. He's still talking about this horrible radical, and he wanted to create these community organizers who would be radicals on the same level as Lucifer, also to disrupt American culture. Alinsky spoke of the haves and the have-nots. Rules for Radicals written for the have-nots and how to take it away. The organizer, Alinsky wrote, is in a true sense reaching for the highest level for which man can reach, to create, to be a great creator, to play God. Now I ask you again, we're going over this, we're seeing this over and over. We see it with Marx, we see it with Lenin, we see it with the Frankfurt School, we see it with Robert Owen, we see it with all of these people who have a Marxist mentality, a communist mentality. Their attack is always against God, and then also they also want to be God. So this is more than just an economic system that they're trying to establish. This is more than just about justice or injustice. This is an assault against God. This is an assault against Christianity. He talks about that the organizer needs to reach for the ability to create, to be a great creator, and to play God. He goes on, it is not enough for the organizer to be in solidarity with the people. He must also cultivate unity against a clearly identifiable enemy. He must specifically name this foe and single out precisely who is to blame for the particular evil. That is the source of the people's angst. In other words, there must be a face associated with the people's discontent. That face, Alinsky taught, must be a personification, not something general or abstract like a corporation or a city hall. Remember, people used to always talk about fighting against the man or fighting against City Hall. Well, Alinsky's tactics said, no, we have to go beyond that. We have to personify this. It can't be just an institution that we're fighting against. It has to be an individual. He says, rather, it should be an individual such as a CEO, a mayor, or a president. And we see that fully implemented in Occupy Wall Street. It started off that, where they came against Wall Street and they started naming people and naming individuals, and they start singling out CEOs. And then it moved again to various leaders to where it progressed. Now we see certainly that Donald Trump is the target that they have picked out. And we're going to look at that also in a little bit. I know some people just, they just hate it when I even mention the man's name. I'm not a Donald Trump worshiper, but I also try to be rational in my observations on certain things. And we're going to look and see again, Saul Alinsky's tactics and how they're carried out. Alinsky summarized it this way: pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. There is no point to tactics unless one has a target upon which to center the attacks. He held that the organizer's task was to cultivate in people's hearts a negative, visceral, emotional response. Do we see that going on today? Cultivate that in the people. Appeal to that anger and rage. Keep people on edge, keep people angry, keep people mad, and appeal to that emotional response, he says. The organizer who forgets the significance of personal identification, said Alinsky, will attempt to answer all objections on the basis of logic and merit. With few exceptions, this is a futile procedure. So he says it's futile to appeal to something based on objective findings, based on logic, based on the facts. He said that's futile. No, just stir people up, get them angry, appeal to their visceral, down to their core. That's how you get a movement going. And that's what we see going on today. People have laid aside all rationale. They have laid aside all logic. They've laid aside the facts. The facts don't matter. They don't count. They don't care. And they just move with with fierce passion, anger, revenge. This is what we see taking place. And this is all fomented by organizers in all the communities. And Saul Alinsky is the father of the community organizers. And he wrote Rules for Radicals to give these organizers marching orders. And now we see these doctrines being played out in our streets every day, and also in our seats of power. He goes on to say in the book, make the enemy live up to their own book of rules. You can kill them with this, for they can no more live up to their own rules than the Christian church can live up to Christianity. Where's the attack again? He says those Christians attack anybody because it's just like the Christians. They can't live up to their Christianity. Basically, it's called all Christianity's hypocrites, but still, that's the target. They're fixated with it. They're obsessed with destroying Christianity. He goes on to say, no organization, including organized religion, can live up to the letter of its own book. You can club them to death with their book of rules and regulations. And so that not only includes the Bible for Christians, but also the Constitution for conservatives and peace-loving Americans, because the Constitution clearly says that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. And so basically bring that up and shame the people, because nobody can live up to the standards set in that book. So in that document. So number one, let's also make the Constitution stink, and all the people who wrote it is racist, misogynist, Indian killers, slave owners. So you can't trust that document. But then also they say, well, you can't live up to it anyway. And so this is the tactic that we see that Saul Alinsky taught, and many are carrying out in our day. Alinsky taught that in order to most effectively cast themselves as defenders of moral principles and human decencies, organizers must react with shock and horror and moral outrage whenever their targeted enemy in any way misspeaks or fails to live up to his book of rules. And we see that all the time. I call it fake rage. Many other people call it fake outrage. Fake outrage. Oh, when Nancy Pelosi gets on, oh, I'm shocked at what they said, and oh, I'm hurt to my core about us. That's fake outrage. That's right out of Alinsky's playbook. Oh, I'm surprised. I'm shocked. I can't believe that our president, he acts so unpresidential. I can't believe the things that he tweets. I can't believe. Fake outrage, straight out of the playbook. Then he goes on, whenever possible, the organizer must deride his enemy and dismiss him as someone unworthy of being taken seriously, because he is either intellectually deficient or morally bankrupt. When it comes to conservatives, remember, toleration toward everything on the left, intolerance toward everything on the right. When you just think about the conservatives throughout, Ronald Reagan, let's start with Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a great conservative. We started off our last video with the speech that he gave. Very on point, very insightful. Well, the left used to always make fun of him because they said he was stupid. Oh, he was a bumbler, he was stupid. And then, of course, when you get to George W. Bush, number 43, they really ridiculed him. Oh, he's a C average. He's a C student. He's so stupid. He doesn't know how to speak. He can't put sentences together. It's always, again, some kind of ridicule. But when it comes to Dick Cheney was a pretty sharp fella, and everybody knew it. I don't know Dick Cheney personally. I'm not trying to defend Dick Cheney. I thought he was a good vice president. Everybody does their good and their bad. They're right and they're wrong. But my point is, Dick Cheney was a pretty sharp cookie. He was smart, and they couldn't refute that. The left could not refute his wisdom, his intellect, and he was very verbal, very articulate. So they said he was evil. So it's that way. So either when they disagree with conservatives, they say that conservatives are either stupid or evil. That's the playbook. Well, this is what it's doing. You criticize them, and that's certainly what we see taking place with Trump. There's absolutely nothing that Trump does that they're happy with. Whatever he says and whatever he does, he's either stupid, he's a clown, he's a buffoon, he can't speak, and on and on and on. I don't see how a man became a billionaire by being as dumb as they say he is. But anyway, that's the idea. We see it played out right in front of us. Laugh at the enemy. in an effort to provoke an irrational anger. Ridicule is man's most potent weapon. It is almost impossible to counterattack ridicule. Also, it infuriates the opposition, who then react to your advantage. And so we see this played out over and over again with conservatives. Newt Gingrich, another sharp guy, smart, articulate, but they just look at him, he's evil. He's like the troll under a bridge. Or anyone else, Rush Limbaugh, very influential, who has impacted the radio, conservative radio, for many decades. And again, he's a racist, he's a bigot, he hates women, on and on and on. It reminds me of in the book of Acts, chapter number 8, with Stephen. He was an evangelist and he was also a deacon, and he came across a synagogue where there was an assembled a synagogue, talking about the freedman's synagogue, and he confronted them and he talked with them and he gave them a wonderful message. Acts chapter 7, when you read the message, it's a beautiful message. He goes through the history of Israel and he brings it up and he ties in Jesus Christ and he preaches the gospel to them. And the scripture says something interesting. They could not resist the wisdom by which he spake. And that's what drove them crazy. Since they couldn't resist the truth and the wisdom and the information coming out of his mouth, they became so incensed that they stoned him to death. And we see the same type of thing happen from the left. If they can't ridicule you, if they can't get away with calling you stupid, if they can't get away with laughing and mocking you, if they can't silence you, then they'll silence your reputation. They'll get you fired from your job. They get you deplatformed from social media. And if that doesn't work, also, some people have wound up dead. There was a poor woman, and we're going to get to the topic of Black Lives Matter when we get to it. But in the news cycle, there's people being fired for saying all lives matter. A young woman was murdered because she said all lives matter. Now, you want to tell me that, the right does that also? The same thing is happening. Conservatives are doing it to the left? No. Again, you're delusional if you think so. But this is the playbook, and we see this carried out. We see how influential Saul Alinsky was. Rules go on. It says, power is not only what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have. Again, it's very deceptive. Whenever possible, go outside the expertise of your enemy so you can throw them off balance. A good tactic is one your people enjoy, because it's always about entertaining the masses. When the people get their pitchforks and torches and they go out and they want to burn somebody down and take somebody out, he says, that's great. Keep that up. Stir that kind of thing up. Keep the pressure on. Never let up, he says. The threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. And boy, do the left use that one real good. If you push a negative hard enough, it will push through and become a positive. In other words, never give up. This is a long march through the institutions. Talking about Saul Alinsky, let's listen to what Patrice Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matters, says. We'll look at this video.
He was concerned, or is concerned, that that there's a lack of perhaps ideological direction in Black Lives Matter that would allow it to fizzle out, as he said, in comparison to Occupy Wall Street. As you are advanced in your own organization, as you all are headed to Cleveland to participate in this Black Lives Movement conference, how do you respond to that particular critique? Again, a loving critique from an elder of the struggle that some others share, that I've even shared as well, to be frank, as a concern about, in part because of the co-optation and the appropriation, that a more clear ideological structuring might be of some value here. But how do you respond to those kinds of, again, loving criticisms?
I think that the criticism is helpful. I also think that it might, I think of a lot of things. The first thing I think is that we actually do have an ideological frame. Myself and Alicia in particular are trained organizers. We are trained Marxists. We are super versed on sort of ideological theories.
Well, out of her own mouth, the context to this video, just a short clip that sort of getting broke into it. She was being interviewed by an individual who are obviously sympathetic to the movement, to the cause, Black Lives Matter. And he was referring to an individual, and I don't know who the individual he was, but he was one of the leaders of the traditional civil rights movement. And this leader had some criticism of Black Lives Matter. He was afraid that they would fizzle out, sort of like the Occupy Wall Street movement. He was afraid that they didn't have any ideological foundations. And so this is what he was criticizing, this is what he's talking about. And so then she talks, and the gentleman asked her, well, what do you think about that? So she says herself that we do have an ideology. We are founded upon an ideology. She said we are trained organizers. What's an organizer? We just read it. Saul Alinsky is the father of community organizers. So she said out of her own mouth, no one put the words in her mouth, she said that she was a trained organizer. Then she said she was a trained Marxist. Well, who is Marx? Karl Marx. It's not Fred Marx or Tim Marx. She's a Marxist. She admits it. Don't we believe people anymore? Don't we believe what anyone says? Many times we don't listen to each other. We think for other people rather than just listen to the individual. And then she finished up by saying that she was super versed on ideologies. Well, let's look at this. Let's look at Black Lives Matter. This is in the news right now. And if you're not on board, well, you're either racist or an Uncle Tom like me. Let's look at Black Lives Matter. Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. So my little cursor here, that's Patrisse Cullors. This is Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi is there to the right. These are the founders and the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. Let's look at some of their tenets. And most people know, I'm just going to give information that the media doesn't give. So most of you know what surrounded, Trayvon Martin and all of those things, Ferguson, Missouri. You know when it was started, why it was started, and all that stuff. But I'm going to give you information that the media doesn't talk about. So we see here, as I mentioned, she's a trained Marxist. She admits that. So that's Karl Marx. That's the Communist Manifesto. Those are his ideologies, his teachings, his doctrines, passed on to Antonio Gramsci, passed on to Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, passed on to Howard Zinn, passed on to Saul Alinsky, and on and on. These are disciples of Karl Marx. She is a disciple of Karl Marx. It's not a different individual. She's also a trained organizer. Saul Alinsky, Rules for Radical. She is a trained organizer. And then she says she was super versed on ideological theories. Well, what are some of those ideological theories? Could they be the Frankfurt School, Weather Underground? We're going to talk about who the Weather Underground is. Antonio Gramsci. We see that Saul Alinsky and Howard Zinn were heavily influenced by Antonio Gramsci. Critical race theory, intersectionality, all of these things. She's super versed in all of these ideologies of her own admittance. Well, let's take this information from the Black Lives Matter website, which the media doesn't talk about. They make it seem like that Black Lives Matter is a movement that's talking about, yes, we talk about the phrase versus the movement. You know, many people in fear, they're saying, well, yeah, I agree with the sentiments of the phrase, but I'm not necessarily down with the movement. And then there are some people saying, yeah, I agree with the phrase and the movement. You know, all of this, we're always divided. I get it, I understand. But let's go and see what they say on their website about themselves. It says, we are guided by the fact that all Black lives matter, regardless of actual or perceived sexual identity. Sexual identity, see if this is about a Black movement. Gender identity, gender expression, economic status, ability, disability, religious beliefs or disbeliefs, immigration status or location. We make space for transgender brothers and sisters to participate and lead. So again, is this about Black lives or just more about something else? We are self-reflective because Patrice Cullors admits that she is a lesbian and she is in a relationship. She's married to a woman who's a transgender, transing into being a man. And Alicia Garza, the same. I'm not saying anything that they already haven't said. And then Opal Tometi, she's not a lesbian, but she is a feminist. But here it says we are self-reflective. Again, they're coming out of a worldview. They're subjective. This regards them, so this is the movement that they want to project. It says we are self-reflective and do the work required to dismantle cisgender privilege. Well, what's cisgender? That's a person who is what they actually were born as. But if this is a Black Lives Matter movement, why are they interested in dismantling the cisgender privilege and uplift Black trans folks? So they want to put down one group, they want to dismantle it. They don't want to just put the transgender up front and make it equal. They want to subjugate, so that, dismantle. We want to dismantle the disgender privilege and then uplift the Black trans folk, especially Black trans women, because after all, they're involved with Black trans women who continue to be disproportionately impacted by trans antagonistic violence. So again, this is all a part of that whole proletariat, the new victim class. Then he goes on and says, we engage comrades. That is communist language. Who walks around and calls each other comrades other than a communist? We make our spaces family friendly and enable parents to fully participate with their children. We dismantle, again, the patriarchal practice that requires mothers to work double shifts so that they can mother in private even as they participate in public justice work. So making the mother oppressed. She has to be a mother and she has to work. And so again, dismantle the patriarchy, that male role. Remember the new bourgeois, the new oppressor are males. We need to get rid of that patriarchal society. Then also listen to the language that they're using. Now, I'm not saying this is what they're saying. They're talking about dismantling and disrupting. They're not talking about equality here. They're talking about subjugating one group of people to lift up another. We disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure. Wow. Disrupt the Western prescribed nuclear family structure? Well, the Western didn't prescribe it, the Bible described it. As I go, this is a movement against God. It's not just about justice. It's not just about equality. Society didn't create the family, God did. So they're talking about disrupting the Western prescribed. In other words, the white man came up with this ideal. The Western prescribed nuclear family, man, woman, father, mother, children, requirements by supporting each other as extended families and villages. After all, it takes a village to raise the children that collectively care for one another. That's that communal, that's that collectivism. Communism is also known as collectivist, especially our children, to the degree that mothers, parents, and children are comfortable. Notice they mention mothers, they mention parents and children, but they don't mention fathers, because that's the patriarchal, because fathers are a part of the problem. This is what's pulled directly from their website. These are their goals. Also, they say, we foster a queer affirming network. When we gather, we do so with the intention of freeing ourselves from the tight grip of heteronormative thinking. See this? They're oppressed, and so they want to break free from the chains of this heteronormative thinking, this heterosexual society that is oppressing the trans and the gays. They want to break free from that. Or rather, the belief that all in the world are heterosexual unless she or he or they disclose otherwise. So we see again, is this more about Black lives or trans lives? As organizers who work with everyday people, BLM members see and understand significant gaps in movement spaces and leadership. Black liberation movements in this country have created room, space, and leadership mostly for Black heterosexuals. This is their complaint. So they're talking about all of the Black liberation movements of the past, all of the civil rights movements of the past have been led mostly by Black males, heterosexual, cisgender men. So not only do they have a problem with white men, white patriarchy, they also have a problem with Black men and Black patriarchy. Then they go on saying leaving women, queer and transgender people and others either out of the movement or in the background to move the work forward with little or no recognition. So basically she's saying all these men are up front in the civil rights movement, in the struggle for equality, in the Black liberation movements, all the men are up front and the women and the queers are marginalized, they're in the back, they're either type of secretaries and they don't get any recognition. Well, that's what this movement is. These are three women, two of them are lesbian and one of them is a feminist, and they're saying, it's our turn now. We want to run the show. We want to have a civil rights movement, but it looks like it's more than just about, it looks like it's more of a trans queer from their own mouths movement than it is a Black movement, because their ideology is driven by Karl Marx and Saul Alinsky, who are white men. So it's not about being Black. They go on, as a network, we have always recognized the need to center the leadership of women and queer and trans people. So they're talking about, they want to center, they want to change the focus. We're tired of Black men leading the movement. It's time for women, queer, and trans people to take over, to maximize our movement muscle and to be intentional about not replicating harmful practices that excluded so many in the past movements for liberation. We made a commitment to placing those at the margins closer to the center, a centrist movement led by women, trans, and gays. We affirm the lives of Black, queer, and trans folks, disabled folks, undocumented folks, folks with records, men, women, and all Blacks along the gender spectrum. Our network centers those who have been marginalized within Black liberation movements. At all BLM events, demonstrators invoke the words that the Marxist revolutionary, former Black Panther, convicted cop killer, and longtime fugitive Assata Shakur once wrote in a letter titled "To My People." It is our duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and support each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains. That's the quote exactly from Marx when he talks about the proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains. Workers of the world, unite. Well, now they're calling for trans of the world, imprisoned of the world, terrorists of the world, unite. We have nothing to lose but our chains. These are a few other things, some of their deeds. We saw their doctrines. Now let's look at some of their deeds, some of their actions. At a December 2014 BLM rally in New York City, marchers chanted in unison, "What do we want? Dead cops. When do we want it? Now." At a march in 2015, the protesters chanted, "Pigs in a blanket, fry them like bacon." The pigs was a reference to police officers in body bags, and the blankets referred to body bags. Coolers also revealed that, that's Patrice Coolers, one of the co-founders, Coolers revealed that for more than a decade, she had been the protege of mentor Eric Mann. Eric Mann was a former domestic terrorist who in the 1960s and 70s was a member of the Students for Democratic Society and the Weather Underground, whose shared objective was to launch a race war against the white United States on behalf of the non-white third world. Man trained Coolers in Marxist, Leninist ideology and the tactics of political organizing. I was watching another interview that she did, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of it. But as I was watching it, she admitted that Eric Mann was her mentor. So this is not something I'm saying about her. She said that Eric Mann was her mentor, and Eric Mann was a domestic terrorist in the 1970s with the Weather Underground, and he trained her. But then also, he is a white man. We see that the white influence in these movements. Sometimes Black people can be so upset and they can be illogical because they're going by their visceral gut that Saul Alinsky told the organizers to appeal to. So sometimes they rise up and they say that all white people are racist. That's part of critical race theory. All white people are racist. White people are racist to their DNA. White people are racist to their core. And white people are racist whether they believe it or not. And if they deny it, this proves. But they work with white people when it suits their cause. It's okay to work with Saul Alinsky. It's okay to work with Eric Mann. It's okay to work with Bill Ayers, Weather Underground, when you're talking about dismantling the patriarchy, when you're talking about dismantling the family, when you're talking about coming against America and making America stink. It's okay to link arms with white people. Then, other than that, all white people are racist. It's inconsistent. But this is what we're dealing with. We see that when you go to their website, again, they are very expansive. It's Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Inc., Black Lives Matter Foundation, Inc. It goes on and on. Let's look at some of their funding, and we're going to finish up with this. I've gone a little long. I've gone over a little bit, a couple minutes, but let's look at their funding. Follow the money. In 2018 and 19, respectively, 1,000 Currents, it's a charitable organization that funds leftist causes. 1,000 Currents funded $2,622,000, and then also in 2019, over $3 million in donor restricted assets to BLM. 1,000 Currents, a woman by the name of Susan Rosenberg, sits on the board of 1,000 Currents. She's a former Marxist terrorist with the notorious May 19th communist organization. And so she sits on this board of 1,000 Currents. Now get this here. She's Susan Rosenberg. She's a former Marxist terrorist. She's a known Marxist. Again, I'm not telling tales out of school. I'm talking about things that was in the news. Well, she sits on this board. She was a member of the only female-run domestic terrorist organization. So you see sort of the connection. The Black Lives Matter women, they admire this woman because she had a female terrorist organization back in the 70s. There were 5 women, and most of them were lesbians, and they led the movement. And they wanted to cast off their white privilege, disassociate themselves with whiteness, and they were Marxists. She was convicted, this Susan Rosenberg was convicted for the murder of 2 police officers and a bank guard, and sentenced to 58 years in prison back in the 1980s. I think it was 1984 where she was finally sentenced. And then Bill Clinton pardoned her his last day in office in 2001. And now again, she went on to academia, she became a professor, but she never let go of her Marxism. There are many other quotes about her and what she says about America and her loyalty and devotion to Marxism. But she sits on the board of this 1,000 Currents that gives out this kind of money to Black Lives Matter. As of June 16, 2020, now major corporations such as Apple, Disney, Nike, and hundreds of others may be pouring untold and uncounted millions into Act Blue charities under the name of Black Lives Matter. So they donate, again, under the umbrella of Act Blue charities, and Act Blue charities gives lots of money to the Democratic Party. But all, again, it flows in under the names of Black Lives Matter. Another major contributor to BLM is billionaire financier George Soros. Through his Open Society Foundations, Soros in 2014 gave at least $33 million to support already established groups. In 2015, the Google Corporation pledged to give the Ella Baker Center a grant of $500,000, which was to be used to fund the efforts of BLM co-founder Patrice Cullors. So $500,000. And Patrice Cullors took $5,000 of that and put it toward literature and some campaigning and kept the $450,000 of it. Also, in the summer of 2016, the Ford Foundation, look at all of these individuals who pour money into this. The Ford Foundation and the Borealis Philanthropy announced the formation of a Black-led movement fund, a 6-year pooled donor campaign whose goal was to raise $100 million for the aforementioned movement for Black Lives Coalition. And then here also are the other funders of the Black Lives Matter movement, Kellogg Foundation, 23andMe, the DNA testing. So when you spit in a cup and send it off to 23andMe, you're funding part of this. Airbnb, Amazon, Apple, Cisco, Disney, DoorDash, Fitbit, Gatorade, Google, Microsoft, Nike, NBA, NFL, MLB, we see it all, it's happening everywhere. The Major League Baseball opening session, a big 200-foot banner, 250-foot banner, Black Lives Matter. The NBA is wearing it on their jerseys. They're putting it on some of the courts. Again, we're seeing that this is a big push behind this movement. It is larger than just those 3 women. That's my contention, because it's also global, it's international, it's in many other countries, this Black Lives Movement. It matches a communist globalist movement because all of the players and the leaders are communists and globalists. So there's a lot of pressure coming. And I like to look at it this way. Let's see, I'm almost, we'll finish on this part, but I want to make a point about this. We know that we live in America, to be honest. America's, the figures, what, 77%, 70%, majority Caucasian out of 330 million people. African Americans, Black Americans make up roughly 13% of the population. There are other Black causes and movements out there that just don't gain the attention because we're only 13%. Again, I'm not trying to be a race baiter here. I'm not talking about race. I don't believe in the concept of race because, again, I look at things from a biblical scriptural worldview. Racism is sin. It's not about skin, it's about sin. So this is my point. But my point is just a matter of fact. Black people pay attention to Black causes normally. They have Black groups, Black societies, Black fraternities in college campuses, and white people just don't pay attention to it. That's all I'm saying. And then, of course, white people have organizations that Black people don't pay attention to. Mexicans, people groups, they have organizations and movements that others don't necessarily pay attention to. But when you look at this movement, all I'm saying is out of 13% of American population, and then obviously all of those 13% are not on board with this Black Lives Matter movement. I'm not on board, and many others are not. So you have a small percentage, a small fraction exerting this type of pressure, not only on America and all of these corporations, but also throughout the world. This is bigger than just those 3 women, is my contention. It's larger than that. Pressure is coming from somewhere else. You have these major corporations who are either on board with this or afraid of it. And my question is, who are they afraid of? Are they afraid of Patrice Cullors and Alicia Garza and Opal Tometi? Are we to believe that these major power conglomerates are afraid of those 3 women? No, my contention is there's something larger behind this movement. There's a push, and it's a global push, and we're going to explore that a little bit as we go also. But I'm going to stop right here. And so we'll have a look for a part 3 of Cultural Marxism. We're still in section number 3 of our presentation, which is dealing with cultural Marxism. But this is a long section. We have a lot to say about it. We've already done part number 1. This is part number 2. Then I'll do a part number 3 so that we can finish up or a presentation on communism, dethroning God. God bless you. We'll see you on the next one.